You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It was a hot Queensland summer day when Nicole Madigan took her son Ben to a sausage sizzle with footy mates for an off-season school holiday catch-up. The boys would play a game of cricket, maybe have a swim, as their parents small-talked over a snag in white bread and soft drinks in plastic cups. As the hours passed, Nicole was beginning to feel dizzy from the heat. Her social stamina was wearing thinner and thinner, so she withdrew to her phone to flick through some of the pictures she'd snapped of her son and his mates on the cricket pitch. A woman she hadn't met, but who'd been a close distance away for most of the day, walked by Nicole as she absent-mindedly scrolled away on her phone. "Are you taking photos of Adam?" the voice said. By the time Nicole looked up, the woman had continued past her. Adam was one of the dads there at the barbecue, but Nicole barely knew him. "I was taking photos of Ben," she mumbled, not that she was sure if the woman was even still in earshot. Nicole had pieced together that the person who'd spoken to her, or rather at her, was Carissa Owens, whose two sons must have played in the same footy club as Ben. It was an interaction that stayed with Nicole a few days longer. She'd found it odd, and she didn't find it any less odd when Carissa reached out that night and a couple more times over the coming days. It made Nicole sort of uncomfortable, but she'd tried to shake it off, and over the coming months, she gave it barely any thought. A year later, that fleeting interaction would become a moment Nicole was forced to re-examine over and over. As Carissa Owens went from being a stranger to Nicole at a barbecue to the source of daily harassments, abuse, threats and intimidation. Somehow, Carissa Owens had become completely obsessed with Nicole. And for reasons she could barely understand, let alone come to terms with, Nicole Madigan had a stalker.
You can either live with this horror for years, or it may take a turn for the worse and there is some physical contact, because ignoring these people doesn't make them go away, and at some point they may seek something else to get that satisfaction if they do get bored.
I'm Emma Gillespie and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The phenomenon of stalking is as prolific as it is insidious. The breadth of quiet suffering perpetrators calculate and inflict on their subjects often leads to victims being completely unable to identify what's happening to them and to seek help. The motivations of stalkers, their behaviours, are often completely unique, leaving the victims of stalking isolated and afraid. But victim survivors are not alone. What threads stalkers together are two factors: fixation and obsession. Back in the 90s, Australian professor Dr. Paul Mullins analysed the behaviour of 145 diagnosed stalkers to deeply examine their motivations and methods. From that research, Dr. Mullins compiled 5 profiles of stalkers which are recognised globally today. Firstly, the rejected stalker, who in most cases is a stalker perpetrating against an ex-partner or someone they're romantically motivated by. The intimacy seeker, a stalker who usually arises out of a context of loneliness. Perhaps they're a shy person without any form of intimate relationship present in their life, but with a desire for one. Their victims are usually strangers or acquaintances. The incompetent suitor. This type of stalker may be completely removed or indifferent to the distress they cause their victim. They might ask their target to go on dates with them multiple times, for example, even when they've been rejected. They're motivated by hopes of a friendship or short-term sexual relationships. The predator, who stalks in the context of deviant sexual practices and interests. The predatory stalker wants to achieve sexual gratification, power, and control over their victim. This type of dangerous perpetrator is more inclined to violence, and most predatory stalkers are male. And lastly, there's the resentful stalker. Someone who wants to create fear and distress in their victim to achieve a sense of control and power. The resentful stalker will feel some sort of injustice and humiliation. They're seeking to even the score with their victim and will often use threats rather than physical violence to intimidate. Carissa Owens was a resentful stalker, and the target of her obsession was Nicole Madigan. Nicole is a journalist and a victim survivor of stalking. Her own experiences led to an investigation into the power, fixation and control that drives stalkers and the havoc they wreak on the lives of their victims. Nicole's expert analysis into the disturbing phenomenon of stalking has culminated in the release of her new book, Obsession, and she joins us today. Nicole, you made a decision to turn your story into a book. I'm sure it wasn't an easy one. What made you feel like this was something you needed to share or wanted to share with the world?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. The first was being a journalist by trade. It's just that need to know, I think. So it started off me researching the psychology behind stalking because, you know, in my situation, one of the big questions I kept asking myself was just why? Why is this person doing this? What's the goal here outside of just trying to ruin my life, basically? So I wanted to look into that a little bit further. And I guess at the same time, throughout my sort of 3-year ordeal, I was writing a lot about domestic violence, and in particular throughout that period, coercive control was really in the spotlight, and really critical to the changes that happened in that time was the sharing of stories, I think. And the more people spoke about what they were going through, the more other women were recognising what they were going through, and then they were speaking out, and it's a really nice ripple effect that has made some really positive change. So those two things combined, were what motivated me to put it into a book.
And did you find that putting that into a book and talking to other victim survivors who had similar experiences to you, or, you know, vastly different but their own versions of a stalking experience, was that healing for you in a way?
Yeah, really, really validating. I think when you speak to someone who's experienced something similar, but not only experienced something similar but responded in a similar way, it makes you feel, for lack of a better term, normal. Like your reaction is okay and it's expected, and what you're going through isn't okay. And it's okay to say that and try to put a stop to it.
Let's start with the very basics. What is stalking?
So essentially, stalking is a pattern of behaviour over time that causes fear for the target. So it's a simple definition, but it's a complex crime.
And how common do you think stalking is?
So statistically speaking, around 1 in 5 women have experienced stalking and around 8% of men. But it's expected that those figures are much higher because a lot of people just don't report a stalking experience. And of those who do, many of those, they don't go anywhere because it's quite hard to get charges laid.
Are those waters murkier with the factor of social media and the sort of new age stalker that you speak about a bit in your book? Does that make that aspect of it harder?
I think so, yes, because, I mean, even we use terms like cybercrime and cyber stalking, which I think trivialises the experience a little bit because times have changed really, and social media is as much a part of our lives as anything else.
I want to dive into your personal story, if you're comfortable. How did you meet Carissa? Now, I should mention, obviously, you've changed names in the book, but we'll continue to call her Carissa.
Yeah.
Who was she? What was the connection? How did she come into your life?
So when I first came across her, I wouldn't say met her because I didn't. I came across her once about a year before this stalking situation took place. I was at a kids' football catch-up. My son played football and my now husband's son also was at that gathering. We didn't know each other really back then apart from sort of being loose acquaintances because we're all parents of kids playing football. So I was at that event just making small talk with the parents as you do at those kind of things and taking a few photos while the kids were playing cricket and things like that. So I was sort of off in my own little world just looking at my phone and I heard someone say, "Are you taking photos of Adam?" And that's my husband's name. And at the time I sort of looked up, oh, was that person talking to me? And she just walked right off and disappeared. So I didn't know whether she was talking to me at that point. I sort of looked at the woman next to me. She gave me a funny look like, well, that was a bit weird. And then I just forgot about it and went on with the rest of the day and went home and then got sort of a strange message from her that night that just sort of said, "Hello, I didn't mean anything by that comment at the cricket today. I just thought you might have been taking some photos for the football page." So still didn't make a lot of sense to me, but I figured she must have known somebody there. So I just kind of shot a response back like, "No worries."
And Adam at that point, he's your husband now, of course, but at that point you weren't together. So it was particularly alarming to hear this person that you didn't know say, "Are you taking photos of this other person who you didn't really yet know?"
Yeah, it was just at that point it just was really weird and sort of just served as a little almost humorous anecdote to tell a couple of friends like, "Oh, this strange thing happened at the kids' footy."
Yeah. And at that point, did you know her relationship or her history with Adam? What was their connection?
I didn't know a lot about it at that point, but they had previously dated on and off.
Did that interaction stay with you into the future or did you sort of just shake it off as, oh, that was a bit weird?
So a couple of weeks after that, I'd got a couple more messages from her that were odd more than alarming to start with. So they were just asking me whether I was married and if I was in a relationship and those sorts of questions. And I found it kind of strange and just kind of put her off. Like,
did you engage? What did you sort of say to her?
I engaged a couple of times at that point. So I just sort of said, why is that? Kind of thing, just kind of asked. And she said, we're just trying to figure it out. And I thought it was quite weird. So I just decided to drop it. And I did drop it. And then I got another couple of messages saying, don't worry, your kids are really beautiful. And I just thought, that's getting a bit weird. And at that point, my mum kind of suggested that, why don't you flick that parent a message and just say you're getting these odd messages because you don't need this in your life. I was going through some other things. So I did. And that's how Adam and I got talking. And then I completely forgot about Carissa after that point.
So about a year passes and in that time you develop a relationship with Adam. Life's happy, you're in a new partnership, things are going well. But Carissa is still in the background. Little did you know. How does she pop back into your life?
Yeah, Adam and I's relationship kind of developed a little bit organically just from those first series of messages. And I guess we just messaged on and off for quite a while. So, yeah, things were going really well and we were hosting our first kind of event, like function as a couple. Our family was there and our children and our friends. So it was a really nice day and things were quite just peaceful and nice, really. Everybody left and we're just tidying up in the kitchen and I get this message request from what looked like a fake account. There was no profile photo and a funny name that had sort of incorporated Adam's name. So I looked at it and then I was just bombarded with a handful of texts that were just really vulgar and crass and explicit and mean and shocking. So at that point, though, I did not realise who it was that was sending those messages.
At what point did you begin to sort of piece all of this together? Did Adam have his suspicions?
Yeah, so I showed him straight away, obviously, and yes, he sort of straight away said, I think that's Carissa. And of course, a couple of hours after that, I also got this sort of alarming text message from my ex-husband and the father of my children that just said, Carissa says hi. So at that point, I sort of knew that she'd contacted him as well.
How did you handle that situation with your ex-husband? There's such a complex web here of someone who sort of dated your now partner, who is beginning to harass you, reaches out to your ex-husband. What did that feel like?
It just felt at that point in time overwhelmingly shocking and almost emotional. I was 37 years old, but I was just sort of new to the dating world, and it was a new life phase for me. So seeing those messages come through kind of shocked me and made me feel quite emotional, and knowing that she'd contacted my ex-husband just kind of frightened me, because obviously you want a nice amicable situation when you've got children involved, and I just didn't know why she had contacted him or what she had said.
Were you able to flag with your ex that there was something a bit sinister there, or had she kind of manipulated the situation?
At that point, I didn't respond to it at all, because I didn't really know what was going on, and I kind of hoped it would just go away. So at that point, no, I didn't speak with him about it. Down the track, I did, because she was trying to involve him quite a bit.
So what starts out as a series of bizarre and vulgar messages escalates quite rapidly. Can you take me through what unfolded then?
So I blocked that account, and within a couple of weeks I got some more messages, but this time they were from Carissa's own personal account. So she'd made her identity quite clear. She wasn't trying to hide that whatsoever. And it was all of a similar nature. They were just quite aggressive and derogatory and crass and vulgar and all quite shocking. I just haven't experienced anything like this at all. And this sort of messaging went on for several months. So it was just one of those things that, every time your phone kind of made a sound, just like, what now? In addition to that, there were a couple of messages that came through from fake accounts as well. I mean, you can tell an account is fake, obviously, by the look of it, but also in one instance, there was a different name that came through, but when I clicked on the account, you could see the username was her name. So at that point, I just didn't know whether she was trying to trick me with these accounts or she kind of wanted me to know what she was doing. I mean, looking back now, I think that's probably the more likely scenario. So that continued to happen. She also contacted my mum and continued to contact my ex-husband. Yeah, so that went on for several months and sort of culminated in her creating a fake account in my name, sending herself some messages on my behalf and screenshotting those and distributing them around. And
what sorts of things did those messages say?
They were supposed to be me sending her lots of photos of myself that she'd obviously got from I've got a private Facebook account, but profile photos, I suppose, and sending them to her just with a lot of vulgar language and things like that. So sort of representing me in the same way that she was behaving, I suppose, was what was happening at that point.
How were you coping during this time? The anxiety of, every time your phone dings, that you might be receiving another barrage of abusive messages. I mean, that's one awful thing on its own. But then to have this kind of attempt to assassinate your character as well, what was happening with you personally?
So up until that point that she contacted my mum and made that fake account in my name, it was more of a really kind of emotional experience. I was just feeling traumatized by what I was reading and not knowing how to switch off from it, because every time I blocked an account, a new one would be made to contact me. You learn new skills to manage that as you go. But at that point, all I knew to do was to block and hope for the best. So that was sort of creating a lot of anxiety and stress, which then turned to fear. That was the first sort of sign of fear for me when she made that fake account in my name and also contacted my mum, because I thought to myself, she seems to be trying to achieve something here in terms of, ruining my reputation or trying to damage my relationships. So that became quite scary. And that was the first time we spoke to police.
Before the point where you decide to take it to the police, you're in a relatively new relationship, in a new stage of your life, and all of the excitement, but also anxiety that can bring. Did you start to feel insecure in your relationship because of the things that she was saying to you, stuff specifically about your partner and specifically about you as a person?
Yeah, it's one of those things where people say to you, and it's easy to say, this person's opinion doesn't matter. And their opinion doesn't matter, but it is really hard to switch off when it's so continuous and so frequent and was covering so many things at that point. And, this is just the early stages. So, yeah, it did cause a lot of stress and sort of flicked a switch in my nature, I suppose. I'm not normally a sort of really paranoid person or anything like that, but it was starting to make me a bit more highly strung, I suppose, because it was on my mind so much and I didn't know where it was going.
There's a point where you start to feel unsafe in your own home because she indicates to you that she knows your address. What was that moment like?
So, yeah, that was towards the end of the 3 years. So after all those Facebook messages, we did follow some instructions by police, which was to write her a letter to warn her basically that if she kept doing this, that we would seek help from police. So things stopped for about 5 months and then kicked right back off again for many, many months after that. So the point that you're talking about was, quite near the end of that, and she'd been posting a lot of really horrible memes and very public Instagram posts. So one of those posts had my address, home address on it. Another one had the date and the time of my upcoming wedding. Some of the others sort of implied that she knew what we had been doing. And then, of course, she had implied that she had moved or relocated to our suburb. So that was when things shifted from sort of a purely online or distant threat to a real one.
When you went to police initially, were your concerns taken seriously, and what were the next steps or what was the advice?
So the first time I went to police, it wasn't officially. It was through someone we knew in the police force, and that was after all the Facebook messages had taken place. And their advice was, if you make an official report, that could escalate everything. So he advised us against that and recommended this letter. And we sent that letter, and of course we thought that had worked because everything went silent for a solid 5 months, 5 or 6 months. And then, of course, it returned. Adam never heard from her again, but it went straight onto me and ramped right up. So the second time I contacted police was when it started back up again, because I was getting a series of text messages from different numbers, which I found kind of scary because of just the effort involved in getting new SIM cards or new numbers seemed quite extreme to me, but I could tell from the language and the content who it was. So I thought that, this was probably me being naive, but I thought maybe the police could track down the person because, you have to register who you are with SIM cards these days, I believed at that time. But when they came to my home, and look, it's hard to articulate what had been going on. It was a long process. It had been over a year at that point. And while the police officer wasn't rude, they didn't really respond as though I was reporting a crime per se, and sort of just gave me a couple of platitudes and told me to, keep a diary and call 000 if I feel unsafe, and left it at that. So there was no official report made or anything like that. So I kind of left feeling really disheartened and helpless, and I just figured, I have to deal with this myself.
Is that an experience that you found common amongst victim survivors of stalking throughout the research for your book, that sort of feeling of nothing is going to change until something terrible happens?
Absolutely. And I think from the research that I did, it's a combination of attitudes and lack of understanding as well, even among police. So it's not to say that police just don't care, because obviously a lot of police do care, but it's understanding the nuances around stalking, and particularly that often with stalking, each behaviour or each incident that takes place is illegal behaviour. It's not illegal in itself to send someone a text message, even if it is a really nasty one. It's not illegal to tell lies. It's not illegal to buy a gift. But it's all of those things put together that create that fear in the victim. So it was really common among the victim survivors that I spoke to that when they reported it to police, that idea of just keep an eye on it, keep track of what's going on and come back if things get worse. But, when things get worse, it's a bit too late.
When did things get worse for you? You've appealed to Carissa with this letter. Things have gotten worse. You've gone to police. They've told you to keep an eye out. What happens next?
I remember this day quite well because we were packing up our home because we'd just bought our first house together. So we were packing up where we were currently living, getting ready to move. And I'm having a little rest and I get this notification from Instagram to say that I've been tagged in a post. So I have a look and it's this horrible looking image with my name listed alongside it and my Instagram account tagged and this horrible little description of why that image was me and a little warning at the bottom saying you'll be hearing a lot more from me and a whole string of emojis. So I was really in shock because that was this was a sign that she'd gone public, I suppose. That was a different type of risk as far as I was concerned that, I could be identified from what she was doing. So I quickly looked up how to de-tag myself and I did that. But from that point on, those Instagram posts became a really regular part of my life and continued to do so for the next many, many months.
Was there a fear that you could run into her or that at any moment there might have been a face-to-face confrontation? Because just thinking back to, the very first time that you were aware that your paths crossed, it's through this community of kids' sport and you're at a sausage sizzle. Was she around this whole time?
Well, I don't know. I did a bit of research. Obviously, I'm a journalist, so I did look into it and I couldn't see a lot of natural opportunity that we would cross paths, but I didn't know to what degree she may orchestrate that to take place. So I just wasn't sure, to be honest, and it does make you paranoid and very anxious, almost to the point, and at the time I didn't know whether I was sort of overreacting here, but to the point where you go outside to check the mail and you just have that creepy feeling like, are they around? And especially once I realised she knew our address, at that time, my husband's car was labelled with his workplace on it and things like that. So it was just a really strange feeling to just not know whether she was around or not.
Did Adam give you any insight into the kind of person Carissa was? Was he able to sort of help you understand maybe her motivations, or was this behaviour different from anything that he had experienced?
So yes and no. So initially when I had contacted him as a person that was just a dad to let him know this, my impression from his reply was he felt very uncomfortable with it but wasn't totally shocked either. And when we spoke further about it, there was some personality traits like that were the reason that they didn't continue to date in the first place. So yeah, I got the impression that she was prone to some of those negative traits, but to the degree that it went to and escalated to shocked him, I think, just as much as anybody else.
Once you were empowered to take this further after Carissa had sort of used images and named you publicly, took it that step further, what were police able to do from that point?
So I was identified from those posts by someone who also knew Carissa and who had been on the receiving end of a similar experience. And she reached out to me, and just hearing somebody else share a similar experience and share those fears, just as we were talking about before, it just really validated what I was going through and made me think, well, hang on, if this person is frightened and is scared for me, maybe I have a reason to be feeling like this. Maybe I should be taking it more seriously. But because I had had such a negative experience with the police so far, I didn't think that calling the police would be of any real benefit. So in the end, I decided to make a cybercrime report. I just decided to try something else. But that also allowed me to write what had happened. And that gave me an opportunity to really describe years worth of events rather than try to summarize that in a conversation. And I think that made the difference in the end. So that report was then handed over to my local police station over several months. Like, it was a long wait. And I received a phone call from a female police officer, and as soon as we started speaking about it, she was just incredibly supportive, acted as though she really understood what I was saying, and she sounded as though she was listening to someone report a crime. And the more I spoke to her and she responded in that way, the more I was able to be honest in how I felt and what I was going through. And she was really incredible in helping me do what I needed to do, because the victim survivor does have to do a lot of evidence gathering and things like that. But she was incredibly helpful in helping me do that.
When you were receiving all of this contact, over the course of a few years, once you realised it had crossed that line and it was really sinister, did you always default to blocking, not engaging, or was there a part of you that was becoming angrier? Did you want to bite back? Did you want to, give Carissa a piece of your mind?
I did, yeah. And when you talk about anger, and I think this, as women in particular, we find hard to talk about and admit, but there were moments throughout that period where I was just consumed by rage and anger. It was barely contained. And really it was, I don't know what it was really that stopped me from doing or saying, what I sometimes imagined I could do or say, which is, similar things to what she was doing, I suppose. You do entertain those thoughts. Like, if police can't help me, I've got to do something. Like, how long do I just put up with this? And she seemed to, a relish in the fact that she could continue to behave like this and I was doing absolutely nothing. So, yes, it is tempting to respond, but I suppose, when you've got a family and a career, you have to try to keep a level head and keep it in check and try to follow the appropriate methods and hope that it leads to the right outcome.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Emma Gillespie. I'm speaking with journalist Nicole Madigan about her experience of being stalked for 3 years. There are so many different types of stalking and behaviours that stalkers will use to intimidate. But what strikes me about your story is it's quite different from what we immediately think of as stalking, because rather than maybe someone, a scorned lover, trying to appeal to someone after rejection, Carissa went to you, a total stranger, and it was a barrage of hatred essentially from the beginning. What did that teach you about the varied nature of stalking itself?
The experience itself left me really baffled, I've got to say, because as you mentioned, to me, this person is a total stranger and she seemed absolutely determined to inflict as much damage as she could to me. She seemed to be enjoying it, and it seemed as though a lot of time was being put into it as well, which I found really difficult to get my head around, because we're also talking about a person who's functioning quite normally in the world, and quite possibly the people that she's interacting with would never suspect something like this, I assume. Obviously, I don't know that for sure. But yeah, look, while I was going through it, I just didn't know. But having researched it, I think there are a lot of different reasons that people stalk and lots of different motivations. But the one commonality is that that person has become obsessed or fixated on another person or an outcome, and they will not stop until they get that outcome.
Do you think Carissa knew that what she was doing was wrong, was harmful, was negatively impacting your life? Or do you think she believes that her actions were somehow justifiable?
That's difficult to say, and I think it's probably a combination of both. Based on the communication that was coming through, I do think she knew what she was doing. There was a lot of, from my perspective, there seemed to be a lot of strategy behind it. It wasn't just simply fly off the handle kind of stuff, although that was there as well. So I think it was a combination of the two. When I spoke to the experts in this field, they said a lot of the time, someone who's engaging in stalking behaviours, they're not looking at it necessarily as an overriding campaign, but as individual incidences. So, something pops into their mind, they must get an answer. They've thought of something, they must tell you that. So, I think when it comes to stalkers, it's a bit of both.
When you had that breakthrough moment where, you've documented all of this, you've submitted a cybercrime report and are contacted by a fairly sympathetic police officer, your first encounter of a positive police officer in this process, did that empower you then to move full steam ahead with taking this further?
Yeah, it really did. Once I spoke to her, it was in her hands a little bit from a legal perspective, and it was really hard to switch off because this went over like a period of many months. In fact, it was almost a year till there was an actual outcome. But I was a bit like a dog with a bone, I guess. I was in quite regular contact with her, what's the next step, what's happening, and it's a long process. So I was put off a little bit, which concerned me, and I thought maybe it wasn't going to go anywhere. And then, of course, one day she let me know that she had charged Carissa with unlawful stalking, and I was just in total shock because I still hadn't attached the word stalking to this experience anyway, and I thought maybe online or cyber was going to be the focus. So I was really shocked but also relieved.
Have you found that victim survivors like yourself, and even in our conversation now I can hear you bringing elements of this in where you minimize a little bit your experience, that you're still sort of not quite fully confident to say all the time, yes, I was 100% a victim of stalking. Where does that come from, do you think?
I think it's because, you're dealing with a non-physical type of abuse that people don't really talk about and that people kind of joke about. So, my exposure to the word stalking before this had all happened was, two different things. One is people joking about it and bragging about it, how great a stalker they are on social media, or stalking somebody's ex or somebody's new friend or colleague.
Before a date, I've already stalked him on Facebook.
Yeah, it's something that's kind of funny that people joke about. Or we're talking about stalker movies, which, everybody loves, and it's a bit salacious and it's a bit fun, even though there's violence and things like that in the movies. So no matter how you're looking at it, it's not really a serious thing, I suppose. And when there's not a physical threat, it's hard to tell someone how you're feeling. Like, I think there are some parallels with coercive control in that it's, to use the word embarrassing is a trivial word to use, but it does apply because you are going through so much trauma, but you almost feel silly to say it because you think that people will think, oh my gosh, you're just totally overreacting. And you wonder yourself, am I overreacting or am I underreacting? Should I be scared and terrified, or should I just chill out and just ignore it and it'll go away? But, of course it doesn't always go away.
There's a researcher in your book who investigated whether or not we're ready for the direct criminalisation of behaviours that cause purely psychological harm. And I think that is bang on for sort of what we're talking about now. Why do you think that is? Why do we have this feeling of, well, if you can't see someone's pain or you can't see someone's crime, that it's somehow not as serious?
I think it's just easier to ignore. We have gone some way, I think, in terms of mental health per se. So if we're talking about diagnosable mental health challenges like anxiety or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, we are moving some way forward in those areas. So if you can say that these things have happened as a result, that's helpful. But I think psychological harm, it goes beyond that as well. So when you've been a victim of stalking, you're consumed by this, and there are some really real repercussions that can take place that might seem trivial from a legal perspective, but are quite real. You can lose your job if someone interferes enough. Your relationships can be ruined. Your reputation can be ruined. Financially, people suffer if they have to change their car or move home. There's a whole lot of things that can happen as a result. And, I interviewed some people that literally had to relocate or leave their job and move because they're protecting themselves.
As a journalist, you already have this extensive knowledge of domestic abuse, of male partner violence, family law. And given so often in our minds, more broadly in sort of popular media, these perpetrators are so often male, did that leave you in a bit of a blind spot with Carissa, do you think? Did that tie into what we're talking about with coming to terms with what was happening to you?
I think so, yes, and from a number of different perspectives actually. The first one being is that we naturally, I think, minimise the risk associated with females because, I mean, for most of that period of 3 years, I didn't fear for my physical safety. I just feared for my emotional safety, basically, and I wanted it to stop. And over time, I wanted more than it to stop. I wanted consequences because I'd gone through so much, I felt, and my life had been changed so significantly, and I thought that was unfair. From my specific perspective, having worked in this field for so long, I'm very conscious that perpetrators are most often male. And I'm very much one of those people that get quite upset when there is a female perpetrator and we have everybody jump on board to say, oh, you know, it is women that do these things, and all the men's rights activists get all up in arms, and I hate that. So to be in this situation, I found I was conflicted about it because I guess I didn't want it to be the case. You know, I don't want to be part of that conversation, I suppose, but here I am. So I think, yeah, it's very gendered, and I think police response changes with the gender of the perpetrator and of the victim. I think, you know, having two females involved made things even more difficult because, I mean, when you have a situation and there's two females and then on the outskirts is a man, it's hard to take seriously, I think, for some people.
It's easier for some people to build a narrative around what that looks like that isn't true, that trivializes it.
Yeah, that just makes it a bit more salacious than actually criminal and scary.
Yeah. You eventually felt that you did want consequences for Carissa, and there was that charge laid. What was the process from there in terms of prosecution going to court?
The whole process was quite difficult, and it made me realise, you know, I was in quite a fortunate position that I was able to do what was asked of me and that I had kept this big folder of evidence, if you like, because I'd been screenshotting and recording things right from the very beginning. I think that was just an instinct for me, maybe because of my work as a journalist. But, I mean, police told me that that's quite rare and that people often delete things like this because they just don't want to think about it or see it. So I was fortunate in that regard. The thing is with stalking is it's quite personal. So over a long period of time, a stalker's able to get to know you and find ways to communicate with you that are less overt. So, you know, in my case, it was some nicknames that were developed over time. So I would know when she was talking about me, but that image on its own probably didn't depict that. So I had to sort of formulate an argument to prove and demonstrate why all of these posts and messages were for me. So it's quite a task. And it's, you know, if you have some barriers like, for example, English being your second language or writing not being your, you know, a particular skill of yours, it could be really, really difficult.
Particularly if your coping mechanism is to try and avoid it. Was it hard for you piecing all of that together, all the while juggling the fact that you did have a stalker? I can imagine it would have been a really, really stressful time.
It was really overwhelming to get all of those pieces of evidence together and look at it all in one hit. And, you know, the process of demonstrating why particularly derogatory nicknames are meant for you is a really unique experience in itself. And it was absolutely horrible. I hated it. But I did it and it was helpful and it worked. So I was lucky in that way.
After what must have felt like an eternity, your day in court with Carissa comes. How did you feel preparing for that moment, knowing you would have to actually see her in person?
I was really, really nervous because technically I didn't have to attend because it's the police versus Carissa, I suppose. They've made the charge. But after so long, I just wanted to see for myself what the outcome would be. And it was a blessing in disguise in the end because it was helpful with the process. But her case was the last that day. So I sat there all day in the courtroom And it was just a really strange feeling because for all of this abuse that had happened and all these insults that felt so personal, I'd never actually been in the same room with her, apart from that brief encounter right at the very beginning. So, yeah, I was really nervous and terrified. And, of course, when she walked in the room, I just, felt like I couldn't breathe. And it's hard to explain why because you're in a safe environment, but it's just the shock of it, I think. It's quite confronting and it was quite nerve-wracking. And, yeah, it was a strange day, but I was, happy with the outcome relative to what I was seeing in the courtroom that day.
What was Carissa's demeanour like when she entered, when she spotted you and then throughout?
So we were all wearing masks then because masks were still mandatory. So it was all eyes, but I was sitting in the corner. This was quite strange actually because she walked in and it would have only been a split second, maybe a second, but she stopped in front of me and just looked at me. And I was just kind of like, is she going to say something? Like, we're in a courtroom. And then she just went and sat down and didn't turn her face again. But in that moment, it was just a really strange feeling.
What was the outcome? You've said that you were pleased with what ended up happening. What was the punishment, the consequences?
So I was pleased because the consequence was, it wasn't a huge consequence, but relative to what I had seen in court that day. So the cases preceding hers were all very violent domestic violence offences, and each one of those perpetrators got a 2-year probation order, bar one, who was already in prison. So as her case was about to be heard, I just thought, if these really violent cases are getting 2-year probation orders, I'm in trouble here. So I was starting to get quite nervous because if she had been let off really leniently, I just worried about what she might have done. But in the end, she pleaded guilty, obviously, in that case, and she was also given a 2-year probation order. The judge was quite proactive as well and recommended and implemented a 2-year restraining order also.
What does that mean in practical terms, the restraining order, the probation?
So the probation order essentially means you may not break the law within that 2-year period or you'll be back in court to deal with that. The restraining order is such that if you break the restraining order, you've naturally broken the probation order. So that's helpful in that way. The restraining order itself prevented her from coming a certain distance from my home, as well as contacting me directly or indirectly via a whole range of means, which included online and social media.
Did Carissa, in the immediate aftermath, do you think take that seriously? Was there evidence online that she was looking to maybe cause more problems for you?
Yes, I think, there are ways of communicating with someone that you've built up this kind of, one of the experts called it a relationship of sorts, between a stalker and a victim because it goes on for so long and you get to know each other. And there are ways of letting someone know that you're watching them without breaking the rules, I suppose. So I will say, yes, that for a little while it was made clear to me that she was still watching, that in the immediate aftermath of that court case, she'd posted a little meme that reflected that quick encounter of making eye contact, So that gave me a kind of a weird feeling. Initially, I went to start shaking again. Oh, my God, she's not going to listen. But I sort of took some solace in the fact that there was, in fact, a restraining order and there was at least some limitations to what she could do. If she breaks that restraining order, I'm obviously going to report it. That's what I was thinking at the time. So,
was it mixed emotions when that started to happen? The sort of build up to this day in court, the relief that there were some punishments, some accountability, and then the fear that it's kind of up to how she interprets that or how far she's willing to take it that could see her back in your life?
Yeah, it's mixed feelings because on the one hand, I'm obviously relieved that there's protection there. So there's only so much that can happen. So as far as actual repercussions and consequences, that risk is very much reduced because she's prevented from doing particular things. knowing someone's still watching is just a different level of discomfort, I suppose. So it changes, I guess. It's more sort of discomfort than fear, although, you're always conscious of when that restraining order ends.
How has that changed your life, your behaviour, your movements?
It's totally changed it. It's totally changed it. Although there are some lasting repercussions, when you spend that amount of time sort of hypervigilant and alert, it changes you a little bit. So, that's something that, I remain quite resentful over, because there are some permanent personality changes, I think, that take place when you've gone through something for so long. But at the same time, I feel really, really vindicated and happy that I don't have that fear that's there all the time, and I don't have that urge to check my name and Google it and just see what's happening around me. So, yeah, I think overall I'm quite happy with the outcome, but I think, I was very lucky as well.
Do you think, and, I don't want to bring this up because I'm sure it's something that you're trying to work hard to put out of your mind. Do you live with a fear that when that 2 years is up, she will pop back up?
I do. And that's probably because it went on for so long, such a long time that I couldn't quite get my head around how someone could have the staying power, really. It just felt incredible that a person, like, life is going on. In that time I moved house, a couple of my kids started high school, I got married, my brother had a baby, like so much is happening and life is going on. And it felt like that wasn't happening for her. It was as though we were back in time. So what does that say about a person? I don't know. I would hope that, being faced with legal consequences would encourage someone to move on. That's what I hope.
What do you think was the driving force behind her motivations? What gave her the steam to keep going for so many years? And is there any commonality there between other stalkers and what motivates them?
So that is the $1 million question, and that was a huge reason why I wanted to do this research, because I just could not figure out the goal. What was the end goal? I mean, it clearly, at the beginning, I thought she's trying to break us up, maybe something like that. I wasn't quite sure. It just all seemed almost juvenile at the beginning until it became, something serious. And I just didn't know what her end goal was. It seemed like she just was very determined to be upsetting and cause destruction in my life. When I spoke to Professor Paul Mullen, who is the man responsible for developing the 5 different stalker profiles, he said that she had fitted into the resentful category. So basically someone who's angry and wants revenge.
This wasn't the first time your wider family had encountered a stalking situation. There is a story in the book about your mum and what she went through. How did that influence your understanding and interpretation of stalking?
Well, it's quite interesting because, if I'm being totally honest with you, I had completely forgotten about that until I was writing this book. And I realised that we're all part of the problem, because at that time we all found that quite sort of shocking, but it was just dealt with and forgotten about. And when you think about it now, it was quite frightening. So we had just got home one day. I was only a teenager, and there was a letter in the mail, and it literally had the chopped up letters like you see on those old-fashioned ransom movies, with my mum's name on it, and a letter inside saying how beautiful she was and this sort of thing. At the time, it probably didn't occur to me as a teenager that this person obviously knows my mum's home address, because it was put in our letterbox. And she also received a couple of calls. She was a real estate agent at that time. A couple of calls from a man, giving his name, as whatever it was at that time, and saying, "Oh, I like your new hair and I love your new blonder hair," because she just had her hair done. So it was, a series of small things, quite different to what I went through, and it only lasted those couple of weeks. But she did leave her job because of that. And when I look back at that now, like, that's a serious life consequence for her following 1 week of behaviour. So no, it didn't shape the way I thought about it, apart from now thinking back going, this is why we need to talk about it more.
In terms of the psychology of stalking, what might look like to us as, just someone with a crush that wanted you to know he liked your haircut, what is the reality for those perpetrators in terms of asserting power, in terms of, making sure that someone knows that they know where they live, for your mum, rather than just saying, I think you're beautiful, it's I think you're beautiful and I know where you live.
Yeah, I know where you live. I know who you are. I've obviously encountered you. You have spoken to me, but you don't know who I am. So in her case, it was the mystery identity, I guess, that was scary, because who knows who it is? It could be someone she had shown an open house to or had booked in to see the following week. That's a scary thought in itself. And I think what's common among all stalkers, from what I have discovered in this research, including Carissa, whose stalking profile was quite different to that experience of my mum's, was that they want you to know that they are watching.
What about erotomania, this disorder where people have a delusional belief that they have a relationship with someone? Often that might be someone of high status or a celebrity or something like that. How does that impact stalking? What's the tie-in for some stalkers there?
So when you look at erotomania under the descriptions of those 5 stalking profiles, it comes under what Professor Mullen called the intimacy seeker. And it's the kind of stalker that we see in a lot of movies, like if you think of a 1 Hour Photo with Robin Williams, if you've seen that. Even Misery, to a degree, where she kidnaps the author. So it's that kind of idea that you've developed this relationship in your mind and you think that you care for the person. So there's this belief that there's something there, you're doing these things for them, and when they don't feel thankful for it or return those feelings, you're almost shocked and therefore angry.
Does that tie in with broader mental health complications? Is there an element to stalking behaviour in that category?
Yeah, so statistically overall, diagnosable mental health challenges aren't particularly common. They're not overriding, but they're not rare either. And they're more prevalent, yes, with the intimacy-seeking type of stalker.
There is such breadth and, as you mentioned, all of those different categories. But obsession, fixation, that seems to be the common thread at the heart of all of this. And, of course, your book is called Obsession. What does that tell us about the self-esteem of perpetrators?
That's an interesting question, because I spoke to a couple of different mental health experts, and sort of their view on it was people who are prone to obsessing and fixating do often have a low self-esteem, and they've probably been like this before. So in other words, in my case, this is probably not the first time that Carissa has become fixated or obsessed on a person or a thing. So there is some predisposition to that kind of feeling. But you're right, across the board, whether you're there to stalk and attack like a predator or you're there to get an ex back or get revenge, the common thread is obsessing.
With the broad spectrum of behaviours that we've spoken about, does that contribute to making it hard to identify when you're being stalked, and then the process of even beginning to think about proving it?
Absolutely, because the key word with what makes something stalking is a pattern. So it has to have happened more than once. Like if somebody writes you a nasty letter or holds you up on the street, they're not stalking you. They might be being rude to you, or they might be harassing you even. So they could be breaking the law, but they might not be. And it can take a while to recognize that yourself, because in the beginning, something might just be annoying. It may even be fun if you're on the receiving end of some sort of romantic interest. You don't necessarily know at the beginning what's about to unfold is something sinister, and that can eventuate over time, which makes collecting evidence difficult.
What can eventuate over time, like for you, could be years of abuse verbally online, or in other cases, physical abuse and harm in that way. What are some of the lasting impacts for victims of stalking?
It's so broad, because many of the people that I spoke to's lives had just completely changed. The way they lived their lives had changed. So, when we talk about violent crimes, we talk about, we should have the right to walk down the street without our keys between our fingers and things like that. For people who have experienced stalking, that extends to everyday things as well, like checking the mail or getting online or sharing some fun news and things like that. So it can make you hypervigilant and paranoid. And then there can be some actual practical repercussions too, like social changes if you've withdrawn or you've lost some friends, work changes if you've lost your job, financially you could have, even small things, you might have to buy a new phone or put security cameras in your home. They're little things that can all add up together to create one big sort of impact because your life has changed and the way you live your life has changed.
Given that most of us are probably walking around right now, whether knowing it or not, with someone in our life who has experienced some element of that, what do you want people to understand most about stalking? What's something that you want people to take away from all this research that you've put together and your book in terms of framing how we see stalking and victim survivors of stalking?
I'd like people to take it more seriously. I think, we are seeing some positive changes around our attitude towards stalking in a domestic violence context. That's starting to change, and it had to change when we see things like the terrible murder of Hannah Clark, which was preceded by stalking behaviours. We know that stalking in a domestic violence context can lead to physical harm and murder. And I think we are changing our attitudes in that regard. But I think the concept of stalking in a non-domestic violence context, we need to take more seriously. I don't think people take it seriously enough. I think it's joked about too much. So I think attitudes need to change. And I think if attitudes change, that gives victim survivors the courage to speak openly about it. Because if you speak about something and you get laughed at or you get dismissed or an eye roll or told, well, get off social media or whatever it is that you're told, you're going to withdraw and think that, maybe I'm overreacting and that you need to put up with it. And two outcomes can result from that. You can either live with this horror for years, or it may take a turn for the worse and there is some physical contact, because ignoring these people doesn't make them go away. And at some point they may seek, something else to get that satisfaction if they do get bored.
A huge thank you to Nicole for sharing her story with us and revisiting her own experiences. If you'd like to read her book Obsession, which investigates the psychology of stalking and its impact on victim survivors, you'll find a link to that in our episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Emma Gillespie, with audio design by Rhiannon Mooney. The executive producer of True Crime Conversations is Gia Moylan. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.